Good evening, everyone. For those of you watching us, my name is Dennis Layton. I'm the Dean of the Jindal School of Languages and Literature, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Vikram Singh Thakur for the seventh installment of this JSSL Distinguished Lecture Series this semester. Dr. Vikram Singh is on the faculty in the School of Letters of Ambedkar University, Delhi. If you've not seen the information about this session and you're just dropping in right now, the title of the presentation is Bidesi Bard and Desi Drama, Aga Hasher Kashmiri's Sufed Khun as Shakespeare's King Lear. So we look forward to this interesting presentation by Dr. Vikram Singh Thakur. Kanupriya, anything I should add at this point? I've lost track, I'm sorry, of the next presentation in the series, the date.
I think Akshay would be the right person to summarize that because we are moving on to the Spanish phase of the lecture series now.
Right, okay. Akshay, you want to tell us about the next presentation?
So we'll have a session on the 16th of May by Dr. Bernardo Masoya. And although the session will be in Spanish, I will be giving an introduction in English and will be taking questions in English as well. The topic is very interesting. He's going to talk about, he has translated an anthology of modern Indian poetry from English into Spanish. So it contains poets from across the Indian spectrum of Indian languages. So he's going to speak about his anthology and modern Indian poetry perceived from a Hispanic lens. So
okay,
that is going to be his topic.
All right, thank you for that preview. So that again is on the 16th of May, and we'll be sending out more information about the day, that as the day approaches. Without further ado then, I welcome Dr. Vikram Singh Thakur and look forward to his presentation today. Please go ahead, Vikram.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you so much. Just give me a second. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Let me take this opportunity to extend my gratitude to the Dean, Professor Dennis Layton, faculty members and staff at the Department of English, Jindal School of Languages and Literature, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you. I'm especially thankful to Dr. Kanupriya Dhingra for her efforts to make this event possible. It's a coincidence that I'm speaking on Shakespeare during his birth week. 4 days ago, in the year 1564, Shakespeare was baptized in Holy Trinity Church, Stratford-upon-Avon, and here I am discussing him not with his compatriots, but with a virtual crowd of Indian academics. One may be tempted to ask, but what's Shakespeare doing in Sonipat or Noida or in Delhi, or for that matter, anywhere in India? And my answer would be simple. I'm speaking about him, for he still speaks to us. That there is a history of colonialism involved is a matter for another discussion. I'll keep it for another lecture, perhaps. That great Shakespeare scholar and Polish communist defector, Jan Kott, had once reminded us that Shakespeare was our contemporary. Isn't it surprising that the popularity of a school dropout has far exceeded that of his Oxbridge contemporaries, who had once called him an upstart crow? How many of us remember those university wits today? But Shakespeare, the upstart crow, shines today as the brightest star in the galaxy of writers. For me, his greatness lies in the fact that he is loved by his friends and foes alike. Take, for instance, the Germans, the British rivals during the period of war, who refused to accept him as a British playwright and appropriated him as a classical German dramatist instead. That notorious warmonger and anti-Semitic named Hitler was particularly inspired by Shakespeare's characterization of Jews, proving Jan Kott's claim right that every historical period found in Shakespeare what it was looking for. So influenced was the Weimar zeitgeist by the Bard's plays that the Hitler Youth organized Shakespeare Weeks in Germany throughout the 1930s. I'm sure that the Führer would have offered German citizenship were he alive, as he once did to the Indian hockey legend Dhyan Chand. Even a country that once described Britain as its most dear enemy, and whose high-headed hot Parisian named Voltaire had called Shakespeare a drunken savage and his plays grotesque, could not resist his talent and welcomed his plays with open arms. Well, it took less than a century for the French public opinion to transform the bard from being a savage to one of the greatest geniuses of all time, courtesy Victor Hugo. Well, time to move on from bardolatry to the topic that I have chosen to speak about, Bidesi bard and Desi drama. But before delving into the story, let me share my contention. A study of modern Indian theatre cannot be anything but comparative. For Indian theatre has been marked by influences that are eclectic right from the days of its inception. Western, classical, folk, traditional, and urban Indian, and so on and so forth. One such influence has been Shakespeare. So let me take this as an entry point into my discussion of King Lear as Sufed Hun. And if you literally translate Sufed Hun in English, it translates as the infilial blood or the blood gone wrong, or but I would prefer the infilial blood. Before I talk about Parsi theatre in which one locates this particular play, or before I talk about anything about the play, I think it's important to talk a little about the playwright and his dramatic oeuvre. So born on 3rd April 1879, Aga Harsha Kashmiri went on to become one of the most prominent playwrights, poets, screenplay writers, and songwriters in India. Like Shakespeare, Harsha was a school dropout who picked up the most relevant lessons from real life. He went to a local madrasa briefly, and his father made sure that he also took lessons in Urdu, Arabic, Persian, and the Quran, for the former had a religious bent of mind. However, Aga Harsha, with his own admission, had no inclination either towards religion or religious education. On the contrary, he was attracted towards the English education that seemed more secular and more modern. After the initial refusal by his father, Harsha was admitted to an English medium school in Banaras. However, when Harsha could not even pass the very first exam, he quit the school. It's during his school days, around this age, around 16 or so, that he had started composing verse in Urdu and Persian, and had even added Harsha as his nom de plume. By the age of 18, Harsha had already composed his first play, Aftab-e-Muhabbat, The Sunshine of Love, within a week. I mean, it took just a week to write this play. And there's an interesting story about it, so I'll keep it for some other time. But he composed his first play at the age of 18 and within a week. And it is said to have sold close to 1,000 copies. Harsha was not even 20 when he moved to Bombay in the year 1898 with a hope to become a playwright. His first employment was with Kawasji Palanji Khatau's Alfred Natak Mandali at the monthly pay of ₹15, which was increased to ₹40 after the success of his first play for the company. And the play was Murid-e-Shak, 1899, and it was based on Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. Harsha himself acknowledged his debt to Shakespeare's play, and in the songbook of this play, Murid-e-Shak, he writes, and I'm quoting him, "I cannot claim how successful I have been in my attempt at what is called the art of translation. However, I can definitely say that I have transformed a foreign beauty into an Indian bride by dressing her in the Asiatic attire and embellishing her with ornaments of Indian humor, and who would definitely prove to be a sweetheart in the performance." End quote. In all, Harsha wrote about 30 plays, covering a vast array of themes and subjects. A close scrutiny of his dramatic oeuvre suggests at least 3 categories in which his plays can be divided. The first is, of course, the Urdu adaptations of Shakespeare, and this is during the early years of Harsha's career in Bombay from 1898 to 1908. close to those 10 years, when he adapted various plays of Shakespeare in Urdu. And these were freewheeling adaptations that included Murid-e-Shak, that is The Winter's Tale, Dil Farosh, The Merchant of Venice, Shahid-e-Naz urf Daman-e-Husn urf Achuta Daman, which is Measure for Measure, Said-e-Havas, Richard III, Sufaid Khoon, King Lear, Khwab-e-Hasti, Macbeth, Khubsurat Bala, again, parts of Macbeth, and Bazm-e-Fani, that's Romeo and Juliet. The second category of his plays would comprise mythological plays, including Bhagirath Ganga, Sita Banbas, that is the exile of Sita, Bhishma Pratigya, Bhishma's vow, and Rustam of Sohrab. The third category would include his social dramas, like Yehudi Ki Ladki, which was later on made into a very famous film also, at least twice. The original script was by Aga Hashra Kashmiri, and it translates as The Jew's Daughter. The second play is Bilwa Mangal, then Mashriki Hoor, Aankh Ka Nasha, so on and so forth. This is not not a complete list of his plays, but just to give you an idea, these are the kinds of plays that he was writing during his dramatic career. Critics have pressed charges against Hashra that his early plays are mere translations of Shakespeare's plays, and hence lack originality. Anis Azmi has argued that this is untrue, since during his early career, Harsh's English was so weak that he could not even enjoy reading Shakespeare's drama, let alone translating them. It is much later that Aga Harsh gathered a little command over the English language. Moreover, Harsh indigenized the bard's plays to such an extent that they appeared to be completely Indian. Thus, it would be inaccurate to call Harsh's plays translations and should rather be seen as free or loose adaptations of Shakespeare. Harsh wrote for about 3 decades for various Parsi theatre companies that included Alfred Natak Mandali, Bombay Theatrical Company, New Alfred Company, the Rising Star, Elphinstone Theatre, Madan Theatres, Calcutta, and so on. He also established his own theatre company by the name of Indian Shakespeare Company, though it had to be shut down within a year. Once Parsi theatre succumbed to the talkies, Harsh also moved to the film industry, and he contributed immensely to the film industry as a screenplay and a songwriter, and is known for giving such successful films as Yehudi Ki Ladki, Shiri Farhad, Aurat Ka Pyar, Dil Ki Aag, and so on. Fascinated by the newly established film industry, Harsh also formed his own film company called Harsh Pictures in Lahore. Unfortunately, he passed away even before its first film, Bhishma Pratigya, could be completed. Now let me move to the next section, which is Parsi theatre, Shakespeare, and Aga Hashra Kashmiri. Before analyzing this relationship between Parsi theatre, Shakespeare, and Kashmiri, it is important to look at what Parsi theatre stands for. Was it performed exclusively by the Parsi community of India? Did it cater only to the Parsi community? Were the actors, directors, playwrights, and managers all Parsis? How does one negotiate such questions that render Parsi theatre its complex character? To some extent, these questions contain some truth, but one needs to go beyond these to capture the complex nature of Parsi theatre. There is no denying the fact that Parsi community of India, especially in Bombay, contributed immensely to Parsi theatre, especially during its early development. Most actors, directors, playwrights, and company managers were Parsis, at least initially. However, it would be a historical inaccuracy and gross misappropriation if one limited Parsi theatre exclusively to the Parsis of Bombay, since non-Parsis too contributed immensely to the newly emerging Parsi theatre. Somnath Gupta, in his dedication to his work called Parsi Theatre Udbhav or Vikas, which is translated as Parsi Theatre Origins and Development, in his dedication, he writes about this significant, aspect which revealed the cosmopolitan and eclectic nature of Parsi theatre. Let me just give you one line, and the translation is mine, from his book, which talks about this eclectic nature. He writes, this particular book, So this work is dedicated to the fond memories of all those Parsis, non-Parsis, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians who formed theatre companies and advertised the dramatic art, who established playhouses and encouraged acting, who became actors and popularized the art of action, playwrights who wrote numerous plays in Gujarati, Hindi, and Urdu, who composed songs and preserved classical music, and he wrote chronicles of Parsi theatre. End quote. In fact, it would not be an exaggeration to claim that Parsi theatre flourished and reached its zenith in the hands of Hindu and Muslim playwrights like Aga Hashra Kashmiri, Betab, and Kathawachak, among many others. My contention is that Parsi theatre should be understood as a theatrical style that emerged in Bombay in the 1850s and in 1870s largely, but soon engulfed the entire India and remained most popular form of theatre, at least till the 1920s. It is worthwhile to see how Gupta defines Parsi theatre, as his definition, unlike many other theatre scholars, is inclusive and gives due credit to all the stakeholders involved in Parsi theatre. And this is how he defines his Parsi theatre. Let me quote him. The Parsi theatre signifies the playhouses built and operated by the Parsi community, along with Parsi playwrights, Parsi dramas, Parsi stages, Parsi theatrical companies, Parsi actors, Parsi directors, and so on. Also included are those playwrights and actors who were not Parsis, but who worked on a salaried basis for the Parsi theatrical companies. Further, those companies, owners, and actors are counted who, while not being from the Parsi community and not being the residents of Bombay, added the words of Bombay to their theatre companies in order to show their connections to the Parsi theatre. Now, Gupta defines this, Parsi theatre as a genre, which is also my contention, rather than an etymologically defined community-specific affair. Parsi theatre was characterized by melodrama, sensationalism, blood and thunder speech, poetry, music, song and dance, gorgeous costumes, expensive sets, painted curtains, display of technology and spectacle, and so on. Gupta writes in his work, if the taste of the Bombay audiences can be guessed from the dramas performed, it seems that they preferred melodramas and farces. This was the influence of the contemporary English theatre. End quote. Thus, Parsi theatre exploited melodrama to a great extent. In fact, melodrama became the defining feature of Parsi theatre, and Shakespeare only furthered the cause, as I'll discuss it later. As far as the languages employed by Parsi theatre, it varied from English initially to Gujarati and then to Urdu and Hindi. It began in the 1850s with the young English-educated Parsi students of Bombay performing plays in English. However, it did not take them to realize the financial prospects that the theatre could offer. Once this realization dawned upon them, Parsi theatre turned towards Gujarati, the adopted mother tongue of the Parsis, and was also spoken and understood by many others in Bombay. However, by the 1870s, Urdu had emerged as the preferred language, as it could also be understood by the migrant population, which by now had a substantial presence in Bombay and also comprised the theatre audience. Urdu or Hindustani, in fact, thus helped Parsi theatre to widen its mass base. By the first decade of the 20th century, the contestation between Urdu and Hindi had already become substantially visible on the national level. And due to this Hindi-Urdu divide, Hindi now made inroads into Parsi theatre and began to be employed widely, not only by the Hindu or Hindi writing playwrights like Radheshyam Kathawachak, but also by Urdu dramatists themselves like Aga Hashra Kashmiri. Aga Hashra Kashmiri's later plays, 1920s onwards, like Bhagirath Ganga, Sita Banvas, Bhishma Pratigya, bear a testimony to this linguistic change taking place in the Indian cultural scene. Having said that, it would be naive to imagine Parsi theatre's influence on Indian theatre by taking into account only these languages. Its strong influence can also be seen on drama and theatre from diverse linguistic traditions like Marathi and Kannada, among others, which modeled their theatre after the Parsi theatre. Bombay in the 1870s witnessed a steady rise of Parsi theatrical companies, all of which competed fiercely with each other. Some of these companies were Zoroastrian Theatrical Company, Elba Theatrical Company, the Shah-e-Alam Natak Mandali, Parsi Ripan Theatre. I mean, there were hundreds of companies. I mean, I can't even name them here, but many of them, right, around 1870s, 80s, 90s, and early 20th century. Among various Urdu dramatists of Parsi theatre were Mahmood Mia Banarsi Ronak, Munshi Vinayak Prasad Talib, Munshi Mehdi Hassan Ehsan, Muhammad Ibrahim Ambalvi Mehshar, Hussain Mia Zarif, Abbas Ali Abbas, Munshi Narayan Prasad Betab, and Radhesham Kathavachak, among many others. But the brightest star in this galaxy of playwrights was Agha Muhammad Shah Hashra Kashmiri. Professional rivalry among these companies was common, and there were instances where a successful play by a company was copied with minor alterations by another company and staged. The managers of these companies would be on a lookout to lure good actors and playwrights, munshis as they were called. So the playwrights were called munshis. To look out to lure good actors and playwrights of other companies. Hence, it was common to find these munshis switching companies for better financial deals. Harsha himself switched a couple of theatre companies during his career, as I've mentioned earlier. The competition among these companies sometimes led a manager to hire a band of clerks to applaud his play to gain publicity, and at other times they were employed to jeer a play staged by another company in order to prove that the play was a failure. Such fierce competition led their owners to spend huge amounts of money on making their productions attractive. For instance, it was common to find spectacular scenes consisting of flying fairies, erupting volcanoes, gorgeous costumes being advertised in their playbills. R.K. Yashnik, a theatre scholar, reports that the stage effects of storms, seas, or rivers in commotion, sieges, steamers, aerial movements, and the like were generally employed and enjoyed by the audience. All these efforts of Parsi theatre helped in modernizing Indian theatre, which was still very young. However, Parsi theatre's biggest contribution was to make modern Indian theatre accessible to the masses, which had hitherto been the affair of the rich and educated Indian elites. Since Parsi theatre catered to a diverse audience, it drew upon eclectic sources for its narratives, like Persian and Indian mythology, medieval legends, histories, and English plays. However, the greatest influence, at least initially, on Parsi theatre was Shakespeare. Shakespeare and Parsi theatre worked well for each other. Shakespeare provided Parsi theatre the necessary material to cater to the needs of his audience in terms of action, spectacle, rhetoric, declamation, and thrill. Parsi theatre in turn popularized Shakespeare's play among the masses. The vogue of translating, adapting, and appropriating Shakespeare, especially by the Urdu playwrights of Parsi theatre, can be judged by the fact that almost every major playwright of Parsi theatre drew upon Shakespeare for his plays. As mentioned earlier, because of his successful adaptations of Shakespeare, Agha Harsha Kashmiri earned for himself the title of Shakespeare-e-Hind. So he was popularly referred to as Shakespeare-e-Hind, that is, Shakespeare of India. Coming to the play that I've chosen for this presentation is Sufed Khoon, which is an adaptation of King Lear by Agha Harsha Kashmiri. Adaptation scholars like Hannah Shkolnikov, Peter Holland, Linda Hutchian, and Margaret Jane Kidney, in their theorization of adaptation, have stressed the need to look for appropriate cultural and gestural parallels in addition to linguistic ones. Preempting this theoretical position of the later adaptation scholars, Agha Harsha Kashmiri had done precisely the same with Shakespeare's plays almost a century ago. Harsha did not aim at linguistic translation of Shakespeare, but a cultural one, and that too in the Indian context. Sufed Khoon is a good example of this process of assimilating Shakespeare in the Indian collective memory. Harsha in his adaptation does not leave any trace of Englishness intact. The characters, locales, stories, costumes, form, everything is indigenized. What Professor C.J. Sisson from England had remarked about Shakespeare in Parsi theatre seems absolutely true of Harshrazat Safed Khoon. And Sisson had once remarked when he had come to India and he had seen some Parsi theatre, he had made this particular remark that Shakespeare is here, that is in India, not translated formally, not imitated, but transplanted as a living organism. And this is in his speech when he comes to India, experiences Parsi theatre, goes back to England, goes back to King's College, and delivers a speech on Shakespeare in India. It's from that particular speech. In adapting Shakespeare, the first change that Harshra introduces is to indigenize the characters in the play. Following the convention of Parsi theatre, Safed Khoon has two mutually exclusive sets of characters. On the one hand are the main characters. So you have Hakan, who's King Lear, Arsalan, Earl of Kent, Saadan, Earl of Gloucester, Bayram is Edmund, Pervez, Edgar, Mahpara is Goneril, Dilara is Regan, and Zara is Cordelia. On the other hand are comic characters who do not exist in Shakespeare's play but have been introduced by Hush. And the names of these characters are also funny. Guldam, Gulkhairo, Turram, Jalil, Baghlol, Thadak, Kadak, and Laila. These are the comic characters. While Safed Khoon does not have a fool, an important dramatic function of the fool, which is comic relief, is provided by these characters in what were called comic scenes. Though such comic scenes did not have any direct bearing on the plot, yet they played an important role besides providing comic relief. To understand this, one needs to pay attention to the Parsi mise-en-scène, which involved staging of two types of scenes, as they were called, deep scenes and shallow scenes. While the deep scenes that were reserved for deeper recesses of the stage presented serious scenes, the shallow scenes that were usually staged downstage and closer to the audience presented comic or less serious scenes. The comic scenes, with a painted curtain depicting commonplaces behind, provided time to prepare the deep scenes at the back that comprise the main action of the play. Safed Khoon is no exception to this formula and features three comic scenes completely independent of the main plot and successfully fulfilling their dramatic function. Such comic scenes in the later years became an indispensable part of Parsi theatre, and almost all playwrights wrote them in their plays. The second important change that Harshra introduced was to reduce the Shakespearean five-act structure to a three-act structure. In fact, Harshra stuck to this three-act structure for his other plays like Asir-e Hirs, The Slave of Greed, and Said-e Havas, Prey to Desire, also. My contention is that the reduction of Shakespearean five-act to three acts was influenced by the performance conditions of Parsi theatre. Songs were an integral part of Parsi theatre, and some were even accompanied by dance sequences. Moreover, it was quite common for the audience to shout for encores, which resulted in repeating songs and scenes to please the audience. Gupt in his work notes that sometimes this created the ridiculous effect of slain characters recently killed in combat, rising from the floor and beginning to fight all over again. Now, one can imagine the amount of time it must have taken for a five-act play to be performed. Harshra made another structural change to King Lear, and this was to do with the opening of the play. While King Lear opens in front of Lear's palace, with Kent and Gloucester introducing the spectators to the impending division of Lear's kingdom, Safed Khoon, that follows the conventions of classical and Indian dramatic traditions, begins with what is called a hamd, or in classical Sanskrit theatre, a nandi, right? An invocation to the gods. And here is a sher, a couplet in verse, from much longer invocation, accompanied by a song and a dance performance in the play. And here it goes. Fasle gulai khili kaliyan dile nashad ki, हो गई दूनी बहारस गुलशने ईजाद की, गा रही है मिलके परियां नगमा हाय तहनियत, खाफ से आवाज आती है मुबारकबाद की. So that's the beginning of King Lear. It is then followed, as if it was not enough, it is followed by a doha, a couplet, then a chorus, and then a song which praises the Lord, and then singing and dancing happens, celebrates the spring season, and then the play proper begins. As it would be clear from these examples, Parsi theatre made extensive use of poetry and poetic language. The Urdu productions and later on the Hindi ones also employed considerable poetry, as it gave an opportunity for declamation and blood and thunder style of speech, which was much appreciated by the audience. Ranveer Singh, a theatre scholar, informs that it had become an established convention in Parsi theatre that actors would leave their poetic dialogues incomplete, only to be completed by the audience in chorus. While this increased the dramatic effect of the speech, it also ensured audience participation and engagement with the performance. As for Shakespeare adaptations in Urdu, Javed Malik, another theatre scholar, notes that the Elizabethan blank verse was transformed into shares and ghazals, or into rhythmic, ornate, and stylized prose known as Nasr Mukhaffa or Nasr Musajja, which is rhyming and rhythmic prose. Since Hashru was an accomplished poet, it only helped him become an incomparable playwright of Parsi theatre. An example of Hashru's poetic imagination can be gauged by comparing Lear's opening speech. Now, this is how Lear speaks in Shakespeare. This is his first speech. Meantime, we shall express our darker purpose. Give me the map here. Know that we have divided in three our kingdom, and it's our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger friends, while we unburdened crawl towards death. And the speech goes on. And here is Hakan from Urdu, King Lear, the Indian Badshah, uttering the same speech in chaste Urdu. And he speaks, "E baise hayate jahan bani, e ruhe rawani sultani, बरसों सैरे जहाने फानी देखी, हर चीज यहाँ की आनी जानी देखी, जो आके न जाए वो बुढ़ापा देखा, जो जाके न आए वो जवानी देखी, अंदेशाए मर्ग व खौफ फरसुरदा ने घेरा है, थोड़े ही अरसे में मेरी शान जिंदगी का सवेरा है, लिहाजा चाहता हूं कि वफात से पहले हयात का एक बड़ा फर्ज है वो चुकाया जाए, यानी नाइत्तफाकी के हाथों से बचाकर ये ताज किसी हकदार के सर चढ़ाया जाए। सबसे पहले मेरे ज़ईफ कान ये सुनना चाहते हैं कि तुम में से हर एक बेटी मुझे किस कदर प्यार करती है। महपारा, तुम औलादे अकबर हो, अव्वल तुम ही से सुने कि तुम्हारी सादतमंदी क्या इजहार करती है। Now, a comparison of these two speeches reveal that Harsha does not make any change in the original speech. It remains close to Lear's in intent, with Hakan expressing his desire to divide his kingdom by running a love test on his daughters. He asks the oldest one, Mahpara, that's Gonril, to be the first to express her love for the Sultan, who gives a very Gonril-like response. And Mahpara, that's Gonril, she says, Jahanpana, अगर ये अम्र सच है कि समंदर का पानी खूजे में नहीं समा सकता, तो इसे भी सच जानिए कि आपकी लाइनतहा मोहब्बत का इजहार ज़बान और कलाम के ज़रिए से नहीं हो सकता। मेरी गोयाई इससे ज़्यादा और कुछ नहीं कह सकती कि जितनी मोहब्बत इस खादिमा को आपसे है, इतनी कोई बेटी अपने बाप से न रखती थी और न रखती है। Even the younger daughter of Hakan, Dilara, that's Regan, also echoes the sentiments of Regan, the original Regan, and declares her love for Hakan in the superlatives. This is how Dilara responds to the love test. Zarra Nawaz, मैं क्या अर्ज करूं? बाजी जान की लाजवाब और सच्ची तकरीर के बाद इस गनीज का कुछ अर्ज करना बेजरूरत है। इतना तो हुजूर भी जानते हैं कि मेरी तबीयत और आपा की तबीयत बिल्कुल एक ही कैफियत। इतना तो आप भी जानते, हुजूर भी जानते हैं कि मेरी तबीयत और आपा की तबीयत की बिल्कुल एक ही कैफियत है। And then she breaks into a poetic affectation. दोनों दिल में जलवा फरमा है मोहब्बत आपकी, दोनों गौहर का है उजाला शम्मा उल्फत आपकी, सर में सौदा आपका, दिल में अकीदत आपकी, मुंह पे कलमा आपका, लब पे मिदहत आपकी, इफ्तिखारी अर्ज भी फ़ख्र समा भी आप हैं, अजी गर खुदा कहता तो हम कहते खुदा भी आप हैं। I mean, she says that I'll declare you as the god. I mean, that's how much I love you. I mean, who can love you like that? Zara, on the other hand, speaks the truth like Cordelia. However, instead of Cordelia's mere "nothing, my lord," Harsha makes Zara respond poetically in the following words. Zara says, "अब्बा जान, मैं क्या अर्ज करूं? इतना तो इतायत मुझसे कहती है कि तू चुप रह नहीं सकती, मगर मेरा ये कहना है कि मैं कुछ कह नहीं सकती." Her reply is followed by a song. She bursts into singing a song, "कर गौर गर है दाना, फिर पड़े ना पछताना," which is basically philosophizing the need to think wisely before iterating anything. A debate then ensues between Hakan and Zara, establishing her Cordelia-like character quite firmly. Songs, like comic scenes, were integral to Parsi theatre and helped in making Parsi theatre a successful industry. Ranveer Singh, in his History of Parsi Theatre, writes that it was important for actors to have knowledge of singing since there was no provision for background singing. Since songs also played the role of dialogues at many places in a play, it was important that the songs were set to such tunes that the audience could easily understand its words and could sing along. Gupta notes that even fighting heroes and dying heroines would sing on the Urdu stage, and that the addiction to songs grew to such an extent that occasions of joy, deaths, wars, and dialogues were all accompanied by singing. Lyrics that were printed on what were called opera books or programs were given to the audience, and one could find audience singing their favorite songs from the opera book. While Parsi theatre used classical Indian music like Thumri, Dadra, Jhinjhoti, Kalingada, beside ghazals, one could also find pieces of Western music. It is interesting to note that Kashmiri had acquainted himself with a few Hindustani ragas at the behest of a poet friend, so as to succeed in playwriting. Sufed Khoon also features a number of songs, at least 22. I mean, 22, I think, must have been much more, but the editions that we've got are not the original editions. So the edition that I have has at least 22 songs in the play. Some are sung by the chorus, while others by the dramatis personae in the play. In fact, almost everyone in the play sings, ranging from a gheet to ghazal and thumri. For example, Arsalan, who's the Kent, he sings a song and then breaks into a ghazal in Act 1, Scene 2. And this is his song. Arsalan sings, "न तन में ताब, न बाजू में बल, न सर में शोर, बदन की फिक्र में कीड़े, कफन की ताक में चोर, कहाँ है तेरा जर और किधर गया वो जोर, सच तो ये है कि एक बेकसी सी छाई है, जवाब दे कि फना पूछने को आई." The song is followed by a ghazal sung by Arsalan. ताजुब ठोकरों में क्यों सरे फगफूर होता है, गुरूर जोर जर इस घर से यूं ही दूर होता है, जवानी में अदम के वास्ते सामान कर गाफिल, मुसाफिर शब से उठते हैं जो जाना दूर होता है, हमारी जिंदगी हश्र मिट्टी का खिलौना है, अजल की एक ठोकर से जो चखना चूर होता है. Another important aspect of Shakespeare adaptations was transforming the tragedies into happy endings. Now, this might have been the influence of classical and traditional theatres of India, which have not entertained tragedy as a dramatic genre, except Bhas. Harsha too finds Sufed Khoon, ends Sufed Khoon happily with Zara and Khakan uniting, and the king reiterating the unfilial deeds of Mahpara, Jahanara, and Bairam is Edmund. Khakan recites a share towards the end, and he says, "ज़ोहाक ना फिराउन ना शद्दाद ने किया, जो तुझ पर और मुझ पर मेरी औलाद ने किया, सीने में हो गया है दिले ना उम्मीद खून, देखा तो क्या सुना भी नहीं ऐसा सफेद खून." The play finally ends with Khakan blessing Zara and her husband and the entire court joining the nuptial celebrations by singing and dancing. So there's an entire, song and dance sequence towards the end where everyone joins in and everyone is happy. And this is a Shakespearean tragedy, which has been, of course, transformed into a happy ending. Towards the end, my contention is, I believe that such eclectic Shakespeare, or some people or some uh, viewers or scholars may call this or may look at it as bastardizing Bard. But for me, this kind of eclectic Shakespeare has always been the hallmark of Parsi theatre. Though Hashra and Parsi theatre took a great deal from Shakespeare, but they always did that on their own terms. Unlike the Indian classroom that played into the hands of colonial discourse, which had already established Shakespeare as the paragon of Western civilization, Parsi theatre freely adapted Shakespeare to suit their purposes. The eclectic nature of Parsi theatre may mislead one to theorize it as essentially hybrid. However, my contention is that one needs to be cautious in locating Parsi theatre in general and Parsi Shakespeare in particular within the discourse of post-colonial hybridity. Parsi theatre's hybrid Shakespeare does not subvert the Shakespearean authority by appropriating it, since it does not recognize that authority in the first place. It does not appropriate Shakespeare, for it follows the colonial discourse that establishes Shakespeare's greatness and universality, but because Shakespeare caters to the melodramatic nature of Parsi theatre, which in turn was determined by the audience's craving for a spectacle that had song, dance, declamation, action, and thrill. There is no doubt that Parsi theatre took a great deal from the Western theatre, including Shakespeare. However, Parsi theatre thoroughly appropriated the European theatre for the native mass consumption. It does not seem that there was a desire to mimic European theatre in order to become like that. Rajiva Verma also argues that even the early Bollywood films, and she extends this particular argument to the films, and I'm borrowing it for Parsi theatre, where she says that even the early Bollywood films based on Parsi theatre productions were not reverential adaptations of a master text, but a case of one professional playwright borrowing plots and situations and other tricks of the trade from another. Thus, one finds that Parsi theatre is hybrid in the sense of being eclectic, not necessarily characterized by the mutations of post-colonial hybridity. Parsi theatre enjoyed its heyday till the 1920s, early 30s, late 20s, after which it started declining due to the advent of cinema in Bombay. Many actors, playwrights, and owners of Parsi theatrical companies joined cinema as it became more lucrative and seemed a better business proposition. However, Parsi theatre continued to exert its influence for decades to come, especially with its legacy of melodrama, poetry, dance, and song, even in films. Let me end my talk in a typical Parsi theatre style by quoting a sher of Aga Sahib, who would usually introduce his takhallus or pen name or nom de plume in the last sher of his dramas, following the classical ghazal tradition. And again, this sher is from Sufed Khun. This is how Sufed Khun ends, with this sher, and then of course there is song and dance. And this one goes like, Ahle zami pe surate mehre falak raho, Ahle zami pe surate mehre falak raho, zinda raho, nihal raho, hashr tak raho. Shukriya. Thank you. And yeah, that's it from my side. I hope I made some sense.
Thank you very much, Vikram. A wonderful presentation, amusing, entertaining, and instructive in so many different ways.
I hope there was something beyond entertainment as well.
No. Entertainment in the best sense, in the way that, just as you said, Parsi theater is not an attempt to undermine or to supplement or something. It's very natural in a way. So that's what I was getting at. The presentation itself was very natural. Let me see here in the chat. I don't know whether we have any questions from the audience. Looks like not at the moment, but Kanupriya, you wanted to say something or ask something?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. It has been a long time since I attended a lecture on Shakespeare, and thanks a lot for that, Dr. Vikram. A couple of thoughts, and I will start with this shorter question. You said that his plays appeared to be completely Indian at some point. So, just a comment from you about what would a completely Indian theater look like, or how would you define it? And beyond that, a broader question about, we're trying to understand how to design our curriculum and so on, now that they launched the English Honors Program. And Shakespeare, as you've mentioned, has been an integral part of understanding literature, even if it has been so far in a very westernized way. So what would, in what capacity would theater study should or should be including Shakespeare in that sense? Now that we are thinking of changing the ways in which we look at Shakespeare for the Indian curriculum.
Okay. Thank you for these questions. The first question where you said Indian. So when I say, by indigenizing or Indianizing or completely making it Indian, I refer to the idea that, there is a certain style, whether you talk about classical Indian theater or folk theaters, there is a certain continuity. So for instance, if you talk about Sanskrit tradition or Sanskrit classical tradition, you have, the Natya Shastra, and you have, rules and regulations, that how this is how a play should be written, this is how it should be performed. And by the 11th century, 12th century, Sanskrit tradition goes to an oblivion. I'm talking about the theatrical tradition, and the theatrical activity after that is sustained by, folk performances or traditional performances, right? But there is still a continuity. For instance, there is still a kind of a Nandi that is happening. So it might have come from the Natya Shastra, it might have come from Sanskrit theater, but you find that also as an important part in folk theaters. Another example I could give you is, for instance, the example of a Sutradhar. I mean, there's no Angrezi synonym for a Sutradhar, so you find a Sutradhar an important constituent in Sanskrit theater, but even in 17th century, 18th century, 19th century folk theaters, which in a sense have got nothing to do with the Natya Shastra, right? But these constituents or these elements had percolated down even to the folk theaters and traditional theaters. So when I say Indian, I'm talking about this kind of continuity which exists. So when Parsi theater begins performing, or especially in Urdu initially, in fact even in Gujarati, so it did cater to, or it did take into account all these continuities with which, which was somewhere deep down a part of the collective conscious of Indians. I'm talking largely about Bombay because Bombay was the place. So I'm talking about, by Indian I meant those sort of continuities which constituted Indian theater's Indianness, right? Which would make our Shakespeare different from the British Shakespeare, right? Otherwise, it's now to give you an example. I would give you another interesting example. This is not from Bombay. This is from Calcutta. And Girish Ghosh, one of the finest theater actors, one of the finest theater directors that Indian theater has ever seen. He adapted Macbeth in 1895, if I'm not wrong, close to that point. The problem is, he did not indigenize Shakespeare. He translated the text into Bengali, but kept the English names. The locale was, again, foreign for the audience. The names were not changed, only the language was changed. And Girish Ghosh had a very fine reputation. And he was a professional theater performer. When he performed his Macbeth, it was taken off the boards just after 10 days. And those were the times when a performance would happen for a year or so, or 2 years. Like 6 months. So his performance was taken off only after 10 performances. And the reason was that he had failed to indigenize it. He had failed to Indianize it. He had translated the text into Bengali, but everything else was not Bengali. And the audience didn't relate with it at all. A few years later, I think 6 years later, yet another Bengali director, more popular in the sense, following the popular theatre mode, just like Parsi theatre. What was his name? Forgetting the name. He'll come to me. But he also adapted Macbeth, right? And he didn't come anywhere close to Girish Ghosh. But when he adapted Macbeth like a Parsi theatrical performance would be, right? And his performance ran for 3 years in Calcutta. It ran for 3 years because he could successfully indigenize it. So his success was the failure of Girish Ghosh. Ghosh didn't indigenize it, and Ghosh actually had admitted that. He was furious when his play was not a successful production. He wrote to his friend, that these illiterate people, they don't understand Shakespeare. All they want to see in a theater is dance and song. He was very critical of that, right? And then after 3 years or so, again, a Macbeth, which runs for 3 years or so. So, this is how, and this is typically Parsi Shakespeare, So that's first. Your second question, perhaps, is, I think, it's very meaningful, and I'm still looking at ways to, tackle this question, because I also teach Shakespeare, but I have not been teaching Shakespeare as part of Shakespeare course, right? I teach Shakespeare as part of modern Indian theatre course, where I teach Shakespeare and this particular play as part of Parsi theatre. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, there has been no translation of any Parsi play script into English. Now, the point is, the kind of poetry that you see in Aga Harsha Kashmiri, who would take up Aga Sahib to be translated into English? It's very difficult. Now, unfortunately, I have to depend upon the Urdu text. Thankfully, it is available in Devanagari. So my students use Devanagari script. Because I think I cannot talk about Parsi theatre without giving them, a taste of what it sounds like. Parsi theatre is about poetry. If you miss out on poetry, but your point is well taken when you say, what should Shakespeare mean to an Indian, right? Especially Indian students, right? And I think Shakespeare in Indian theatre has got a lot to contribute to, even to the academic discourse, rather than, freezing Shakespeare, inside textbooks, making him, a demigod and putting him on a pedestal, or the flip side is also true. Thinking about this colonial discourse in Shakespeare, post-colonial scholars, and that is fine. I'm not saying that don't critically engage, but we also need to critically engage with his productions. Why just in India, but other places, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Germany, in various other places. That is how new interpretations will emerge. Otherwise, for the last 400 years, what new interpretation can emerge if your perspective towards Shakespeare is still the same? If you still think him to be a British playwright, Germans never thought him to be a British playwright. They always thought he's a classical, German playwright. So I think what needs to be done, even in academia, while we are teaching Shakespeare as a textbook, simultaneously we also need to look at these engagements through performance or different takes or different styles. For instance, there's so many. Watch a Pia Behrupia, for instance. It's available, I think, on Netflix. Pia Behrupia's 12th Night. You the Nautanki form, or you see, Bhan Pather, which is Badshah Pather, which is M.K. Raina, if you know M.K. from Delhi. So M.K. did this beautiful production with the Bhand artists from Kashmir, and he adapted King Lear into Bhan Pather. and he gave them a story and let them do what they wanted to do with King Lear, right? And it's a beautiful production which has traveled. So I think it gains yet another meaning when we talk about this. Otherwise, we can read Shakespeare, but we won't be able to relate with Shakespeare at all. It's the same thing. Just a joke, but we kept on saying daffodils, 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 but I never saw a daffodil in my life. Right.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So
I
for
mean,
me, the गेंदे का फूल, right? Maximum. उससे ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं.
Yeah. I'm already thinking of a course title called Shakespeare in South Asia. Maybe that will kind of help us narrow it down and for us
Now,
to.
there's enough research. There are enough books that have been published on Shakespeare in South Asia. Shakespeare in India, at least 3-4 books. Shakespeare in South Africa, Shakespeare in Iran, Shakespeare in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. There is enough material now available.
Of course. Thank you. We already have a question here where Shreya is asking if the titles in Parsi adaptations did justice to the original titles of Shakespearean plays.
I didn't get the question. Thank you so much, sir, for the hybridized Indian perspective. I would like to ask, do the titles in Parsi adaptation did justice to the original titles? There was no question of justice. That's what I'm saying. They were hardly bothered about doing justice. They didn't even treat it as, as a translation. So forget about. So for instance, Khubsurat Bala. Sometimes it may not. Sometimes it may. But they were under no obligation to justify the title. For instance, Khoon Ka Khoon may be justified. For instance, Khoon Ka Khoon is Hamlet. Right? Or Khoon-e-Nahak, not by Kashmiri, but by Ahsan. Prior to Khoon-e-Nahak, the unjust murder, is Hamlet. Or for instance, Sufed Khoon is very meaningful, even more meaningful than King Lear. The unfilial children, the unfilial blood. Because King Lear doesn't give you an idea what the play is about. Right? But the moment you say the unfilial blood or Sufed Khoon, it gives you an idea that this play is about. So, it depends. But they were under no obligation. Depended upon, because they have very funny names also. Chalta Purza.
Which is called?
Chalta Purza, which is, I'm forgetting which play adaptation, but yeah, it's a Kali Nagin, Zahiri Samp. Zahiri Samp is Cymbeline.
Okay.
Antony and Cleopatra is even more funny. So, sometimes it would attract the audience. They'll keep the name, keeping in mind that the way it happens today. Now, RRR doesn't make any sense. Title, but still one of the most popular films in contemporary Indian cinema. So, yeah.
I had a question. So I was really, first of all, thanks for the brilliant exposition. And I was really, what you, I think, unwittingly clarified for me in the course of the presentation was, we obviously soft heard that Bollywood has a huge in Parsi theatre, but when you outlined these distinct characteristics of Parsi theatre, we can see that it's there for as clear as water for everyone, clear as daylight that Bollywood has followed the same trend of Parsi theatre and retained many of its distinctive characteristics, including the emphasis on poetry and comic relief, which we can see till date in Bollywood films. Now, I wanted to ask you about the adaptations in Bollywood, which have been, what is your take on those adaptations? Because you have studied these Parsi adaptations as well, and you have obviously examined them in depth. So what do you think about these Bollywood adaptations such as Maqbool or Omkara? Do you think that they do justice? Or do they follow the trend of the Parsi adaptations, which were freer and had no regard for such canonical authority as such? So I just wanted to ask you about that.
It's a difficult question. You know why? I'm not a film scholar and I hardly watch films. So I must have seen Maqbool once, Haider once. I haven't even, Omkara at least once, long back. So to do a kind of, to justify or to say that, I can give you a very balanced answer would be wrong because I don't understand film. Film is not my medium. But if you look at film as a text, just as a literary sort of text, I think for me, this question doesn't even matter, that whether we are being fidel to Shakespeare or not. I mean, how does it make a difference today? I mean, I am not a purist, right? I, 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 I still remember a review that I had read somewhere, and this was by some British journalist who was in Calcutta or in Bombay, I guess, who had written that we can't allow this to happen. We can't allow these illiterate Indians to murder Shakespeare night after night, every single day. Right? He was so offended. What is it? I mean, there is song and there is dance, and Shakespeare has lost its meaning. For me, as a theatre practitioner, this question doesn't exist. I may be taking from Shakespeare, but I'm under no obligation to be fidel to Shakespeare. One can say, of course, abhi to copyright bhi nahi, there's not even a copyright issue. But even in terms of, whether these films are, I mean, if you say good adaptations, I would call them good adaptations because they have been adapted in a certain cultural context, which makes a lot of sense. But a comparison, perhaps, there's no comparison, and I don't even want. And if someone wants to actually draw a comparison, one might say it's not critical enough. For instance, either may not be that critical enough, or for instance, Omkara may not be that a critical retake of the original play. But then the question is, what is original? I mean, even Shakespeare's original is not so original. So I think this question, but I think a film scholar perhaps may want to answer it differently. If I look at it only through this fidelity criticism, I think with the kind of journey Shakespeare has had over 400 years, I mean, there's no original Shakespeare, and there is even quarto and folio, if one looks, I mean, some 1100 lines missing from Hamlet. And so which one do we trust? But yeah, someone might say that in essence, it comes closer to what Shakespeare had wanted to express through his Hamlet. So there may be one such moment when you might feel, oh, here it is. I could get it very briefly, and I really enjoyed it. But otherwise, there is no point looking at the entire film and comparing whether it's.
Yeah. So, what do you think about the Tatar tradition in Konkani in Goa? Do you think? I mean, the Tatar tradition in Konkani in Goa, you have this. I think popular theater, which is I don't know whether you have you're familiar with it. So it is called Tatar, and I think even they have they have maintained this tradition of staging popular plays. Even in Goa, you can find in village squares and all. So I just, when you talked about Pasi Theatre, it just came to mind as well. It's still going strong. So I just sort of made that connection.
Maybe. For instance, the mobile theaters of Assam.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, they could do Shakespeare. I mean, amazingly. But yes, I mean, the only problem is professional theater in India itself is so lacking. I mean, you hardly have any professional theater in India. I mean, if you create a production, you can't sustain it beyond two performances. Sorry. So, I mean, that's not how, and I mean, in the name of professional theater, all you have is something in Gurgaon, which is like Zangura or something. No, because that is something which, I mean, you can survive on that single production for years.
Right.
That's what a professional theater is. That, each professional theater is not something, which has two shows and it dies. Then why perform at all? So theater in India actually is sustained by amateurs. Someone is a doctor, someone is a lawyer. They come in the evening, they think, we'll get together, perform a play once in every 2 months or once in every 3 months. Otherwise, NSD, of course, there are a few educational sort of Sarkari institutions that do it. I'm not discounting their efforts, but largely, it's really difficult, professional theaters. I mean, even NSD people they have to run to Bombay, to the film industry. So how will theater survive?
We do have a question here from Pratibha
Pratibha.
Biswas. They're allowed to speak.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Thakur, for this splendid talk. My question is very practical and from a pedagogical point of view. I find teaching theater quite challenging in the class. Why? Because we have to incorporate performance in it, right? But the kind of students that we get these days, they hardly have any exposure to theater. And you mentioned how the survival of theater itself is in question. So could you please share a few experiences of yours from classroom where you've incorporated certain tricks, if I may use the word, or
Yeah, you can. The first thing I do whenever I do a dramatic reading in a class, I tell them, please don't be formal in my class. Sit wherever you want to sit. If you want to sleep, if you want to lie down on the floor, if you want to stand up on the bench, feel that this is a class where you can do anything. If you want to sing, please sing your dialects. If you think you want to cry and say something, please do that. Feel free. I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, otherwise it doesn't make any sense if they have their, texts in hand and they're sitting perfectly, all right, just like a gentleman or a lady in a class. Your bodies are so, you're tied up. So the first thing I need to do with them is just tell them, forget about anything, forget about what's happening outside, grab a corner if you like, sleep if you like, stand up on the desk, free yourself, right? And then slowly and gradually build upon this kind of uh, role playing. But it takes time. But then, for instance, I give them a few minutes to think about characters. For instance, if someone is playing whatever, Shakespeare's Hamlet or another, I'm not talking specifically about Shakespeare, but any of these characters, I'll give them some time. Go to a corner, think about it, or go home, come back tomorrow, think about it, think about who you are, think about what kind of clothes do you wear, think about who are your friends, think about you are not in the exact situation, but approximately how near can you go to this person, right? Think about all these questions, try and relate with uh, you know with the present. That's more important. I mean, don't just transport yourself to the times of Shakespeare. It won't make any sense. The first thing students will ask is, where are the witches? They don't exist. Then one also needs to tell them that you have to suspend this kind of a disbelief that whether witches exist or not, and witches are not witches. So my idea of teaching drama, whenever I teach drama, I try and do that at least through one or two plays, because a semester long or 3 months, 4 months long semester cannot have a lot many things. You can't do much about it. But I make sure that I do at least one dramatic reading, at least 3 classes or 4 classes of dramatic reading, or at least one play, and I tell them to just free themselves, to think, to sing. I ask them if you want to play guitar while playing this particular song, or if someone is delivering a dialogue, and if you think this guitar makes sense, or some music makes sense, bring it on tomorrow. We'll play with that. And then the presentations, I also make I give them presentations towards the end of the semester, and I give them a choice. So you can make either a critical sort of an old school presentation, whatever, themes in Hamlet or themes in King Lear, or you could choose a creative project where you could design a particular, let's say, a scene from Shakespeare, or whatever play we are doing, or whatever long list that I have of plays. If you want to develop music, let's say, for a particular scene, do that, bring it on. But then just the music won't help, since I have to grade you. So you have to write the process. You have to tell us your choices. You will tell us your sources. You will discuss why this and why not something else. So some students opt for creative projects. For instance, I still remember some time ago, someone had designed costumes for characters in in Andhayuk. In fact, one of my students, and I really take pride, she's not here, Anna. She did a wonderful job. She adapted Andha Yug into a graphic uh, novel, and it's an amazing work that she's done. Uh, and this was part of her MA dissertation. And I can share the work if you want to. I think Dennis might have seen it some time back, a few years ago. But I can share that. It's wonderful. So this kind of engagement is important, I guess, which cannot come only through the textbook, especially the course like drama.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was really enriching, and I would definitely try to use some of these things in my classroom.
Give them flexibility and just tell them, forget about who Shakespeare is. And forget about what does he mean. Just think, what does this mean to you? I'll give you this example. When M.K. Raina had gone to a kingdom is a village and he was there on Ford Foundation Fellowship. And MK was to do King Lear with these Bhand actors. And these Bhand actors had not done any Bhand for the past few years because during the times of high terrorism militancy, these Bhands were banned from performing by the extremists. Their dhols and their nagaras and their musical instruments were broken. Their costumes were torn away. Someone even committed suicide for he could not perform. So it was after Ford Foundation's money and fellowship that he said that, I want to go back to Kingdom. And he's a Kashmiri Pandit, right? So he goes back to this village and tells these people who are mostly illiterate people that I want to do King Lear. It's exactly the same, ma'am, as you would do in a class. He gives them the text and he gives them the translation. He thought Hindi mein karenge. And he gives them a translation of Harivansh Rai Bachchan's Macbeth. Now, Harivansh Rai Bachchan's Macbeth doesn't make any sense to these illiterate actors, most of whom couldn't even read. And even if someone could read, it was Hindi. But Hindi is not their language, sorry to say, but Hindi is still not our national language. And many people there didn't like to, they didn't understand Hindi. And after a few days, Raina realized that this is not going to work. He said, forget about this, chuck it. This is the story. He narrated them the story. There is a Raja, there is, 10 daughters, and, the kingdom has to be divided. And he said, now do what you want to do with this. And then began this ensemble, like this process. And they created a wonderful process. Of course, then Raina intervened later on. This is exactly what Habib Tanveer once did. Not once, I mean his theatre. If you look at Habib Tanveer's theatre as Charandas Chor, for instance, or any other, for Habib Tanveer, he says, it took me 30 years to realize that what he had been doing in theatre was just rubbish. He was just wasting his time. It takes a lot to acknowledge this self-failure for someone like Habib Tanveer, for someone like, who's so big. But he says after 30 years of doing theatre, he said, whatever I had been doing, I was not doing, I was just wasting my time. Because he also says the same thing, that I was trying to work with these folk actors and I was trying to work with them in Hindi. And they were struggling with their Hindi. The second problem, he says, when I was trying to direct them, he says, I was trying to impose my theatre knowledge that I had acquired in Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, England, and try to block their scenes, walk one step and take 2 steps and go back. He says these folk actors don't work like that. They have their own systems, and you need to understand and respect their systems. And only then, and once he realized that, it took him close to 30 years. But that's how Charandas Chor happened in the 30th or the 34th year of his career. Charandas didn't happen while he had started his career. So I think, yeah.
So Vikram, I'm sorry, this may be a banal question, but so I understand the points you're making about cultural translations and cultural adaptations. And I mean, the example you just gave, a particular community or milieu of drama, those practitioners will adapt that particular story or situation to their own purposes, and that's part of their art, and there's really no point of questioning that. But I'm just kind of curious, when you talked about your classroom experiments where you want everyone to feel comfortable and at home and do whatever they want. So I understand a cultural adaptation. What I have trouble grasping is a very individualized adaptation. So what are the next steps then? I mean, once you've got everyone comfortable and they're sleeping or drinking tea or whatever, talking in whatever way they want, obviously you want to bring it to some other kind of, finished position also, right? So what's the next stage?
The first thing
Next stages.
when you're doing theater, drama in class, or whether in a theater class or a literature class, or since I come from a background and having done some theater, the first thing this does is open up their minds to the text. Otherwise, if you give someone Shakespeare, and one is bothered by this, one is overwhelmed by this idea that you're supposed to read this text, which doesn't make sense. I mean, whose language perhaps doesn't make much sense to him. It's really difficult to relate. For instance, I'll give you an instance. Someone a few years ago, a student in BA, she wrote in her answers, "I really like Shakespeare," and the reason that she'd written was he wrote in very simple English. She might have read some, lamb stories or whatever, and he used very simple English, and that's why I like him, because other writers are difficult, but Shakespeare is very. So that there's always this danger. But I don't want to stop only at sipping tea, and that's the first stage, so that you're not overwhelmed by the play. B, you begin to have a connect with what you're going to read, and thankfully you can do that with drama. You can't do that with a novel. I mean.
Yeah. No, I guess what I'm asking, sorry to interrupt, I guess what I'm asking is how to get these various individualized perspectives that emerge as part of the kind of ice-breaking process to cohere. So, I mean, as a non-theater person, I'm completely naive about this, so that's why I'm asking you how you kind of get it to cohere.
Right. So once this process is done, once they are ready at least to take a plunge into it, right, then you go about, see, for instance, if I'm talking about Shakespeare, I will have to talk about the historical conditions of those times. I'll have to talk about Elizabethan theatre. I'll have to talk about the politics of the time, right? Once you also start bringing in those things, it makes a lot of sense then to place that text that you're reading alongside your modern day interpretations of it, but also trying to place them historically in those contexts, which of course I take upon myself as a teacher to give. I don't expect my students to have knowledge about, let's say, Elizabethan theatre or Marathi theatre or Parsi theatre, for instance. So once they start relating at least with the text, once they're into it, then I try and open up the more difficult part of it, which is go back in time, try and introduce the politics of the play, of the times, the theatrical conditions, other discourses, and then try to see or fit them there. And then they try to read that play in those particular sort of times. They may come up with their own interpretations, but then they have to be guided. And since I think we're doing literature, it's really, really difficult to say that, Wilson Knight's interpretation is the only right interpretation, or Nahum Tate's interpretation is the only right interpretation, or for that matter, anyone's, or even mine. But if you come up with a certain logic and try to make it sound sort of, if you try and make it sound convincing with the textual evidence. So see, that's the problem. You can't go away from the text, right? So you will have to, from within the text, you will have to bring in your interpretations. They may be very individualistic interpretations, but if they come from the text, and if that is supported by whatever logic that you have or argument that you have, I think that makes some sense. For instance, there are students who in many classes, and I've learned it, what does it mean, for instance, if I'm reading a play like Shantata Court Chalu, Silence, the Court is in Session, today, when I read it with a very different sort of mindset. But when today's students read it, they bring into their own, and I don't call it individualistic interpretation, that may be the case, but also since the times have changed, they also bring in I mean, if I call it this modern zeitgeist or into that interpretation, which I never thought about it. So I think there's a lot of learning happening there also.
Sure.
But there's no one interpretation, of course. But simply just because they can say anything without any textual support, I would not buy it. That is for sure.
No, just thinking about the very minimal kind of way of making sense of Shakespeare in any culture. I was, just as you were talking, I was remembering something I'd watched years ago. It was a comedic routine on film by a well-known German humorist, Karl. I don't remember his surname. He was someone who was a stage actor, but a kind of a comedic actor. He was also in films for a while, and some kind of joke involving Hamlet and omelet. And the punchline is basically that he gets confused because he's been talking to the waiter, and the waiter brings him the food. He says, "Well, I couldn't bring you Hamlet, so I just brought you omelet instead."
Right.
Anyway,
You're right. I mean, that's how, at least, the biggest problem today, I mean, with present generation is to get them to the play. Because they consider any text that you give to most of them as a burden, as an overwhelming text, as something which they have to read because it's part of the course. So the first thing for me is, just to get this off their heads that this is going to be an interesting class. And I've seen this at least with my drama classes. I enjoy doing the drama classes the most. Students also enjoy doing drama classes the most than theory. But there is a way to it, and that's why once you've got them into it, then of course you try to be an academic and try to preach. I don't try to do that, but then there's some preaching that happens at a later stage. I can do that right away. I go to the class, first day, I'm going to read you Shakespeare. Shakespeare was this, and Elizabethan England was this. I don't think that'll work, with me at least. I mean, there are ways people who have different ways of teaching. But yes.
thanks. Yeah.
I don't think we have any more questions, so we could conclude the session now.
Q.
Yes, I think we've reached the natural end of this, and thank you, Dr. Thakur. I found this, I don't take it again the right way, but I found this just my speed for a Saturday afternoon. I'm appropriating your presentation for my own purposes, mixing it with my own ideas here, and I'm very grateful to you for having helped me with this. And I know you've written a wonderful book about some of this, so I've taken it in on a more serious level also. But I enjoyed this very much. Thank you, and I'm glad we had an audience here this Saturday afternoon or evening. Again, Akshay Kale had said a little bit about our next installment, which again will be next month on May 16th. We're taking a slightly different turn. We've been, our presentations up to this point have been in English, if not all necessarily about English authors or English texts. We'll be taking on a Hispanic turn for the next one, where the speaker, I guess, will be speaking in Spanish with translation from Akshay. But thank you very much, Dr. Thakur. Very entertaining, and talk to you again soon.
Just to entertain you.
Yep.
Just one.
Sure.
The Anglo-Indian novelist Sam Sterling, who recently made a comment, not very recent, but I think a few years ago, he made a comment that had Shakespeare been alive today, he would have been writing for Bollywood. So, from Parsi theatre to Bollywood.
Yeah.
There's everything in Shakespeare. And that's why, Jan Kott says that every generation finds something in Shakespeare that they're looking for. Even Hitler could find something.
Although you have to wonder about, I'm sorry, I know we're supposed to be reaching the end, but you have to wonder about the general kind of evolution of Shakespeare from tragedy towards farce, or for that matter, tragedy towards melodrama. Because you can actually see it in other contexts too. It's not just in India and Bollywood. I think there's something about maybe it has to do with what you were just referring to, the kind of high seriousness of Shakespeare, which maybe tempts people into maybe not consciously subverting it, but doing something very different with it, so that even in, say, Hollywood films or other Western film industries, often the very scene of someone doing Shakespeare, or say a scene within a film of people acting, taking Shakespeare, tends to turn it into something, farcical. So anyway, we can talk about this another time. But I'm just wondering whether there's a kind of general transition from Shakespeare, from at least Shakespeare's tragedies towards farce or even melodrama. But anyway, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Glad you could attend, and we hope to see you in future talks in this series also.
Thank you.